my pleasure to introduce Richard Klein to you tonight. I've known Richard 5 or 6 years now. He gave me my basic training in streams and how to save them. Richard has been president of Save Our Streams. He worked with DNR for 18 years. He's author of several books on the subject of how to save streams. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Richard. Richard, tell us how to save our streams.
Thank you, John. My name's Richard Klein. I run an organization called Community and Environmental Defense Services. What I'd like to talk to you about this evening is the single most important thing you could do to accelerate the recovery of the Severn River. I'm going to show you how with just an hour of your time, you can save literally 100 feet of waterway. And again, there's nothing that you can do, lobbying, working on a lawsuit, or handing out flyers, or even putting in oyster reefs. Those things are all important. But if you're looking for the most effective thing to restore the Severn, I'm going to show it to you in the next 25 minutes. So, before I get into the presentation, let me tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. I started out exactly the same place that you all started out, as well as Anastasia and Linda. In the 1950s, my family moved from South Baltimore to the suburbs of Baltimore, and I fell in love with something called White Marsh Run, a lot like Severn Run. And at that time, back in the mid-50s, you could find 12 different species of fish in the stream. You could swim in it, you could wade in it, and foolishly, we used to even drink out of the stream. Never got sick, though. Then they built the Baltimore Beltway across the headwaters of White Marsh Run, and it started dying. And then a lot of other development followed that. And by the time I graduated from high school, the stream went from 12 species of fish to just one. And I filed my first sediment control complaint in the 1970s, and I've been doing it ever since. And fortunately, over the last 10 years, we've discovered ways of greatly increasing the effectiveness of citizen advocates in improving not only erosion, sediment control, and construction sites, but compliance with all of our other clean water laws, because frankly, enforcement of all of our clean water laws is a far cry from what we all think it should be. In my day job, I run an organization called Community and Environmental Defense Services. We help people all over the U.S. with a variety of concerns that might affect a neighborhood or the environment. It includes things like making neighborhood streets safer. Neighborhood streets are the most dangerous streets that exist. Keeping development from causing school overcrowding, and of course, protecting aquatic resources. The map you see in the lower right, those red dots, those are places around the U.S. where we've helped citizens protect their neighborhoods and the environment. These are the 4 topics I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes. I'm going to stop after each topic so we can take a few minutes of questions so I can clear up the confusion I create. So, please hold your questions till the breaks. The first topic is construction site mud pollution, exactly what Linda and Anastasia just showed you. The second is what comes after a construction site is completed, stormwater runoff. The third topic I'm going to talk about is why I know that in the past compliance with our erosion control and stormwater laws has been so poor. And lastly, I'm going to show the approach that we use to dramatically increase compliance. It's a solution that really works, and it's a lot easier than trying to work with inspectors and enforcement agencies to get things corrected. Because with this approach, we go to the actual decision makers, the folks who are responsible for poor erosion control and stormwater maintenance. On to the first site, construction site mud off. The waterway you see here is actually the one that Linda and Anastasia were talking about. This muddy creek is the one that was impacted by that golf course that Anastasia and Linda mentioned. If that site were fully complying with all erosion sediment control laws, the creek would not be muddy. So, first thing to understand in trying to prevent construction sites from damaging waterways like the Severn is that most of the muddiness is caused by clay particles and the finer silts. These things are so fine that clay takes weeks or months to settle out of suspension, which is the reason why perimeter controls like silt fence and ponds aren't effective in keeping waters from getting very muddy. These are the two basic approaches to controlling construction site pollution. Sediment control, which is commonly evidenced by silt fence like you see here, or ponds, small ones called traps, larger ones called basins. The trouble is, because clay takes a long time to settle, neither one of those measures can control the muddiness that construction causes. It's only the other approach, erosion control, where you cover exposed soil with a thick layer of straw mulch or plant areas with grass that can reduce clay pollution enough to keep nearby waterways clean. This graph compares the relative effectiveness of the different ways of controlling construction site mud pollution. That first graph, of course, is no control. A lot of folks like to say, we had no control in the 60s and the 70s, but we no longer have no control. Or you get no control every time that there's a storm that exceeds what the perimeter controls are designed for. We get no control all the time. And a single construction site with no control can damage 3 miles of downstream waters, with recovery taking up to a century. With sediment control, you reduce the muddiness a little bit, but whoops, I'm having the same problem that Linda had. You reduce a little bit, but not much. It's only with erosion control that you make a dramatic reduction in the muddiness that you get in construction site runoff. If you are able to plant areas in grass, which is one of the requirements of both state and county law, you can actually get the muddiness down below this river protection standard. So there are two concepts regarding mud pollution control that are really important to keep in mind. And once you realize these two things, it puts it all in perspective. The first thing is that mud pollution is not caused by the storms that occur every week or every month. But the worst mud pollution is caused by the storms that occur 10% of the time. That is, 90% of the mud that flows from a construction site leaves the site during the worst 10% of storms. And it's during those storms that perimeter controls, like this silt fence here, simply get overwhelmed. There's such a tremendous volume of runoff that these conventional perimeter controls simply can't handle it, and all the mud goes down into a nearby waterway. The second important concept is, again, that thing with clay. Clay takes weeks to settle from suspension, and usually what happens is you have a pond like this one that captures runoff from the last storm, and the clay is still sitting there. It's been 2 weeks since any runoff went into this pond. So by the time the next storm comes by, the runoff from the next storm flushes all this muddy water out into a nearby waterway. So those two concepts explain why the conventional approaches of silt fence, ponds, the other things, simply aren't effective in protecting aquatic resources. It's only erosion control that can come close to fully protecting waters like the Severn, Lake Ogleton, the other waters that are damaged by construction site runoff. Most of the erosion control starts with something called hydroseeding, where mulch, fertilizer, and grass are applied all at the same time. For areas around areas that are going to get a lot of foot traffic, vehicle traffic, like where buildings are under construction, you put down a thick layer of straw mulch, thick enough so you can't see the soil through it. And if you do that, you reduce the runoff volume by 60% and the erosion by 90%. For areas that aren't going to have much in the way of foot or vehicle traffic, you're required by state law and actually federal and county to seed it all with grass. And with a thick cover of grass, you reduce the erosion by 99% and runoff volume by an equivalent amount. Road beds and parking lot beds, they're required to be covered with 4 inches of stone. It's called the base course. It's part of building a road or a parking lot, but it's pretty effective in reducing erosion. So, as I said before, this is what federal, state, and county law actually requires. It's not something extra that developers do to be nice to you. It's what developers are supposed to be doing and what inspectors are supposed to be enforcing. But as I'm going to explain in a minute, there's a problem that keeps those inspectors from doing their job. So, how do you know when earth moving has ended and it's time to start covering all the exposed soil with mulch, grass, or other erosion control measures? Well, earth moving pretty much ends when you start seeing roads and homes and other structures being built on a construction site. Again, what the law says is that once all the earth moving stops on a construction site, all exposed soil has to be covered with straw, grass, stone, or some other erosion control measure. You know that earth moving has stopped when you see them start to building things. That's because they move earth around to bring the site up to the point, rough grade, where you can start building stuff. So when you see roads and buildings under construction, you know that all the exposed soil that you see is supposed to be covered by these erosion control measures. So to find out just how good compliance with the erosion control law is, back in 2014, Lynn and a number of other folks that are in the room participated in the Greater Baltimore Survey. You see Lynn here. So Lynn, raise your hand. Lynn was one of more than 100 volunteers that surveyed 225 construction sites in Baltimore City, the 5 surrounding counties, including Anne Arundel. So how good or bad is erosion control compliance? It was this bad in 2014. In 2014, on average, only 23% of the sites fully complied with the law. In Anne Arundel County, it was only 16%. Fortunately, the publicity and the political pressure that was generated by the first Greater Baltimore Survey produced results. The compliance level went from 23% for the region to 37%. That's a 61% improvement. And here in Anne Arundel County, it more than doubled. Compliance went from 16% to 40%. This stuff really works. When you advocate right, you get results. And what I'm going to show you in the remainder of the presentation explains how to do it. So this is something else that I think could go a long way towards greatly increasing voluntary compliance. What you see here are 2 palm cards. The one on the left is the techie, heady one that I did. And the really interesting one on the right is one that Brad Knopf did. Brad, raise your hand. There he is. Brad is responsible for that. And you've got a copy of that on your table. So I think that if we could get this simple message, exposed soil equals pollution, to be generally known, that the voluntary level of compliance that we would see from contractors would skyrocket. I think that if every time that somebody passes a construction site and they see exposed soil, they think, come the next storm, some nearby waterway is going to be polluted, because that's the truth. You can't reduce the amount of mud that flows from a construction site sufficiently to protect aquatic resources unless you cover all the exposed soil with straw, grass, or stone. So, and if you also see that they've started building things on the construction site, you're also seeing a violation of federal, state, and local law. If we can get just 5 or 10 or 20% of the population of the 100,000 residents in the Severn watershed to realize that and start complaining every time they see exposed soil on a construction site, instead of just complaining about silt fence, which never works except when you get nothing more than a heavy dew, I think that the voluntary compliance with this stuff will increase dramatically. So why don't we do questions for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on to the next topic. Yes, ma'am?
Are there any extra of those cards for those of us who aren't at the table?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Are there any extra of those cards for those of us who aren't at the table?
There's a few up here. Yeah. Tom, why don't you gather them up? Looks like there's a bunch of extras. Yes, ma'am.
What's the timeline for after I'm not sure I'm using the right words, but when you said a construction site has, quote, settled, and when grass and whatever needs to start getting planted?
For most construction sites, that initial clearing, earth moving phase lasts about 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks on a really, really big site. But for most sites, they should be able to get the site up to rough grade within 2 weeks. And then at that point, what state, federal, and local law requires is that all the exposed soil has to be covered with straw, grass, stone, or some other erosion control measure. What the law actually says is that what the law actually says is that within 7 days, after they cease grading activity on the site, that's when everything has to be stabilized. So, one other question, ma'am?
What about before the earth movement ends? All the grading is in the process. We have rain like this, and it all washes away.
Well, the first thing that the contractor is required to do is to just clear a narrow swath along the downslope edge of the construction site and put in the perimeter controls, silt fence, ponds, what have you, and there's no way that those measures are going to keep much in the way of the clay out. They will keep the gravel, sand, and the coarser silts out. Now, there is a requirement that came out of the Chesapeake Bay program that contractors start using things called flocculating agents in sediment ponds, which would actually settle the clays out of suspension. But I don't think anybody's requiring that yet. I'm not even sure if anyone has the authority to require it. But there's no reason why we can't ask for it, and no reason why we shouldn't demand it. And with the next portion of the slideshow, you're going to see why there's a good chance we could achieve that. One more burning question.
Who do you complain to?
Pardon?
Who do you complain to?
Let's cover that in the next portion of the slideshow. Yes, ma'am.
If they've started building and the ground is not covered, it's a violation of local, federal, state laws.
Yes.
And by building, does that include a baseball diamond?
Yes.
So they are currently in violation of local, federal, and state.
Yeah, if they've stopped earth moving on the entire, any portion of the site where they're no longer bulldozing, pushing earth around, state law says that when 7 days have passed after the earth moving has ended, on any portion of the site, that area needs to be stabilized with mulch, grass, or stone.
So has anyone complained about?
Let's not get into that detail. As you're going to see, there's a better way to go about achieving these goals. So I need to go on. I'm sorry. So the next portion of the presentation deals with what happens after the construction site has been covered with houses, other buildings, parking lots, streets, lawns, what have you. As you're going to see, that stormwater pollution from developed lands is the single biggest source of pollution impacting the Severn River and, frankly, all other suburban urban rivers in the U.S. So, and this pollution, it comes from our homes, it comes from our neighborhoods, it comes from the places where we work and shop, it comes from this building, it comes from this parking lot, it comes from our highways, it comes from anywhere where there are impervious surfaces, rooftops, parking lots, streets, sidewalks, anything that prevents runoff from soaking into the ground. And a lot of it also comes from our lawns. So this is the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load Document. How many of you have read this thing? Wow, I didn't think I could one here. That's incredible. This publication lists the 3 pollutants that are most damaging to the Chesapeake Bay. They're also the same 3 pollutants that are most damaging to the Severn and, frankly, all other suburban urban rivers in the U.S. So I'm going to use nitrogen as a conversation piece for this portion of the presentation. This graph, which is based upon the Chesapeake Bay model, shows that stormwater runoff from developed lands accounts for more than half of all the nitrogen that's flowing into the Severn. The same is mostly true for sediment and phosphorus as well. So it's the biggest single source of stormwater pollution for the Severn. These are the 6 most common practices, stormwater best management practices, that were installed to control not only flooding and runoff from a developed site, but also the stormwater pollution as well. So the good news is that each one of those red dots that you see here is an existing stormwater BMP, best management practice. There are more than 2,000 of these things in the Severn River watershed. The yellow line that you see here, that's the Severn River watershed. Whenever rain falls within that yellow line, it's either going to flow to the Severn eventually, or it's going to evaporate back into the atmosphere. So you got all these existing stormwater best management practices spread throughout the watershed. That's the good news. These BMPs vary quite a bit in their effectiveness. Dry ponds are the least effective. They don't remove any pollution. They're pretty much worthless. Then ponds that hold water, they're moderately effective. And infiltration and bioretention, that's the most effective practices. They remove 80% of nitrogen, 85 and 95% of the phosphorus and sediment. I call infiltration and bioretention highly effective BMPs, and I'm going to be talking about these. They should be our focus. So when a BMP is first installed on the development site, the owner signs an agreement like this one with the county that says the owner is going to maintain that BMP. And this agreement applies not only to the original owner, but all subsequent owners. So the people who own BMPs, and a lot of them are owned by homeowner associations, schools or commercial property owners, everyone who owns a BMP, they are legally bound to maintain the thing. And then this state law requires the county to inspect each BMP at least once every 3 years for maintenance. So I got good news and I got bad news. Good news is that 96% of BMP owners voluntarily maintain their BMPs. It's very rare that you have to take the owner of a BMP to court to get them to maintain it. That's the good news. The bad news is that the only way that the maintenance gets done is if somebody tells the BMP owner that they got to do something to keep the BMP working properly. And the trouble is that there are a lot of BMP owners out there who don't know they own BMPs, much less know that they're supposed to be maintained. So that's why county inspections, the county inspection staff are so important for keeping these things maintained. They go out, they identify problems, they talk with the owner, they explain how to get them fixed, and usually 96% of the time, the fixes get done. So it's pretty easy to assess the condition of a best management practice. None of this is rocket science. However, because there are different types of BMPs, it is a bit complex. Here you see an infiltration trench. This stone-filled area here, it actually extends down into the soil 3 to 20 feet, and it's all filled with 2-inch stone. And stormwater coming off of, this happens to be Maryland 3, stormwater flows into this thing, it gets stored in the air spaces between the stones, then it all soaks down through the soil column underneath the infiltration trench. And as it passes through the soil, 80 to 95% of the pollutants are removed. This is the most common BMP in the Severn watershed, probably in Maryland. 25% of all the BMPs that are in the Severn watershed are infiltration trenches like this. And just to show you how terribly difficult it is to figure out whether or not these are working, they're supposed to drain completely within 48 hours after a storm stops. So if you come by and you see standing water in one of these things, when 2 days or more has elapsed since the last storm, or you see wetland vegetation growing in it, you know that it's not draining within 48 hours, so it's got a problem. You'd be amazed at how many of those there are out here. There's actually one of these 50 feet behind me that's full of water right now. So this is bioretention, also called a rain garden. On new development sites, this is the most common and frankly the most effective BMP that's out there. And the way that these are designed, runoff from, say, a parking lot flows into the bioretention area. It's stored here above this filter bed, and it can't flow out until the water level gets up to the storm drain inlet, then it dumps in. But as the runoff percolates down through the filter media, again, 80 to 95% of all the pollutants coming from that parking lot are removed. Never make it to the Severn. As with infiltration trenches, if you see standing water or wetland vegetation, it means it's not draining in 48 hours. So it's failing, and there are a lot of those out there that have failed. Wet ponds are pretty easy to assess too. Here you see a wet pond that's been recently completed. It's easy to see where the original surface area was. When wet ponds are doing their job, they're trapping sediment. Then cattails and other wetland plants colonize the sediment. And when you lose 10% or more of the original surface area, all the sediment has to be cleaned from the wet pond. That's how easy it is. I mean, no rocket science. So most BMPs, again, you may recognize this person here. She keeps showing up on these surveys. Most BMPs can be assessed from adjoining public areas. There's no need for trespass. This bioretention facility is being assessed by Lynn and two other folks from an adjoining sidewalk. We produce these fact sheets, and I'm going to show you where you can download these for each of the different BMP types. The fact sheets not only explain the benefits of a BMP to a homeowners association and nearby residents, but how to assess them for maintenance needs. So again, these fact sheets are readily available. And to figure out how to find BMPs, we did this fact sheet, but an easier way to do it is to go to this Maryland Department of the Environment webpage. Just Google the name Stormwater print, and you can download a map that looks like this one. Each of those blue dots that you see on there is an existing stormwater BMP, and this is probably a name that you all will recognize. So this failing BMP is right over there, 50 feet. So you can see there are these BMPs, these blue dots all over the place. Any questions? Yes, sir. Depends on the BMP. For bioretention, again, the most common and effective BMP on new development sites, the maintenance is usually nothing more than coming in every 2 or 3 years, raking up the old wood chips on the surface, scarifying the surface with a garden rake, and then putting down 2 to 3 inches of hardwood bark mulch. That's it. And the best guess is that because of the way bioretention is designed, they could last for a really long time, provided that maintenance is done every 2 to 3 years. And it's actually something that I think that volunteers with a group like SRA should consider doing to make sure that they actually are maintained. Infiltration trenches, problem is they're not so easy to repair. I mean, you've got 3 to 20 feet of stone, and I suspect that a lot of infiltration trenches that fail, if they do get repaired, and a lot of them don't get repaired, that the best thing to do would be to convert them to bioretention facilities. Dig up all the stone and then put filter media down in that trench and then design them as bioretention. And bioretention is a heck of a lot easier to maintain than an infiltration trench because all the problems occur at the surface. With infiltration, everything occurs down 3 to 20 feet down in the ground. Yes, ma'am.
What about the sediment, though, that gets into rain gardens and bioretention? There's a lot of sediment that
Right.
will get into those, not just the infiltration.
Well, each rain garden and bioretention facility is supposed to have a sediment trapping measure of some sort preceding it. Usually it's 20 to 30 feet of grass that the runoff has to flow over to get into it. So actually the amount of sediment that you get from a parking lot or a rooftop or any other impervious surface, it's pretty low. When sediment kills an infiltration practice, it's usually because there is exposed soil somewhere in the drainage area. So that's what kills them. And yeah, if you get sediment accumulations, that's the quickest way to kill an infiltration facility. Yes, sir?
Just back up and show the URL again.
I'm going to show all the URLs in a minute. So, any other questions or, yeah?
A developer builds a subdivision, puts the BMPs in, finishes building, turns the keys over to the community association. What's the requirement to provide adequate budget and guidance about how to maintain the facilities? It's been a problem on the project because people in this room know more about what I just said than I do.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty much a problem everywhere. Again, 96% of the folks that find out that their BMP has a maintenance problem, they do the maintenance. They get it done. So, but you're right.
But should there be a requirement on the developer to provide some guidance or some budget provision for the HOA?
It should be in the HOA bylaws, but frankly, I don't know a great deal about that. It's something that I can research, and if I can get your name and email address after the presentation, I'll research it and drop a line to you. Any other burning questions? Yes, ma'am.
Are there any best best practices around swales, you know, like you're driving on the road and then they have these big gutters on the side of the road to collect water. Some places I've seen communities have, you know, grass, other ones just have asphalt. So am I using the right term, swale?
Yeah, a swale is a highly effective BMP. It's designed as a very long bioretention facility. So however, the grass channels that you see in older communities built 40, 50, 60 years ago, they do a pretty good job of reducing stream channel erosion due to the increased flooding that you get from development, but they trap very little in the way of pollutants. So you have to design, if something's going to trap pollutants, there are only two ways of doing that. It either needs to get the pollutants well down below the soil surface so they can't be flushed away by those really big monstrous storm events, or they need to be stored at the bottom of a pool of water, as in a wet pond. So if you don't have that, then generally BMP is going to be pretty ineffective. Why don't we go on to the,
She's had her hand up.
Oh, okay, sorry.
In answer to John's question, I'm from the Broadneck Peninsula. We've had disasters over there with stormwater, and we have had more disasters with the financial side that you all just covered. And Chris Phipps and his directors of OPC and IMD. Chris is the director of the Department of Public Works, and they've been working for over a year. I've been working with them. I've had presentations to them on how the homeowners are truly getting, excuse my language, but they're getting screwed on the way these contracts are set up. So that, he said he's close to finalizing it, but the contracts are being changed to protect the homeowners, and when he's finished, we'll see. Another thing I wanted to point out is when you are a developer and you are developing a site that needs stormwater facilities, what they're doing is they are hiring landscapers. Now, they come on my property and do a design, dig a hole, and put a plan in, but they are not trained, they're not certified for the complex piping that is needed for
Right.
stormwater facilities.
I understand.
That has gone right to Steve Schu's office.
Yeah, why don't we move on, and this presentation is going to be finished in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can spend time discussing all these things. But actually, we do have a solution to propose for the maintenance problem, so I'll leave you with that teaser. So here's the, it's not a $64,000 question. It's definitely a $64 million question, and it might even be a $64 billion question when you think about the effect of polluted water on property value and on loss of quality of life that you could get from having a high-quality aquatic resource within walking distance of your home. So the question is, these BMPs, both construction site and stormwater BMPs, they could be keeping a tremendous amount of pollution out of the Severn, but are they actually achieving that goal? Back in 2011, I did this audit for the Severn River Association. I volunteered about 800 hours of my time to produce this audit. And unfortunately, one of the things that we found as a result of the audit was that half of the stormwater BMPs we looked at in the Severn River watershed were failing. That's pretty depressing. The good news is that by 2015, because of the Greater Baltimore Survey and other things that had happened, that the BMP failure rate was cut in half countywide, and that's probably true for the Severn watershed as well. So what I'd like to do is, with the next few slides, help you understand why that 50% failure occurred. And the reason why I'm hoping to explain why that happened is that to prevent this from recurring in the future, we got to know what happened in the past that got us into so much trouble, that robbed us of so many benefits that these thousands of BMPs could have been providing for everyone who lives along the Severn, and frankly, everyone who lives in the watershed. So the problem began in 2001. For reasons that no one ever has adequately explained, Anne Arundel County cut its stormwater inspection staff from 6 full-time inspectors to 1. 10 years later, after 10 years of greatly reduced inspections and therefore very few BMP owners finding out that their BMP needed maintenance, half the BMPs were failing. So, in 2012, the Severn River Association and 8 other groups sent this letter to then County Executive Leopold, bringing the problem to his attention and making it clear that there was widespread public support for fixing this problem. And within a year or so, County Executive Leopold had restored the stormwater inspection staff to the 2001 level of 6 full-time inspectors. We did the Greater Baltimore Stormwater BMP audit in 2015, and yes, that's Lynn again on the front cover of the report there. And we had 42 volunteers from 17 different watershed groups that looked at more than 331 BMPs in Baltimore City and the 5 surrounding counties. And what we found was that between 2011 and 2015, after restoring the inspection staff to the full complement, that the percent of BMPs that were failing in Anne Arundel County had dropped from 50% to 25%. This stuff really, really works. It's not make-believe, it's not smoke and mirrors. This stuff really, really works when you do the advocacy right. And in a minute, I'll explain how to do the advocacy right. But first, before getting to that, I think it would be helpful to try to understand why it was that for 10 years, Anne Arundel County had such a severe paucity of inspection and so little maintenance was going on, why it was that that was allowed to continue for 10 years. Well, I think these are the 5 reasons that account for that. And I'm not throwing rocks at anybody. Lord knows we're all really busy and we got a lot of things competing for our time. But I think these are the reasons why stormwater BMP failure rates reach such an alarming level. First of all, stormwater BMP assessment, it's not rocket science, but it is a little complicated. And it does take some training to understand how to do it. When we do stormwater BMP surveys, the training lasts 15 minutes. So it's not terribly time consuming. It's very simple. The trouble is that no one offers training on how to assess BMPs that's oriented to volunteers. Most of the training that's out there, you've got to sit through a webinar for 2 or 3 hours or go to a day-long workshop, and you never really learn the stuff that we show in all honesty. So you don't learn that wetland vegetation in an infiltration device is a danger signal. Nobody uses that. I could show you the official guidance document on evaluating bioretention, and nowhere in there is there any mention of wetland vegetation. So the few folks that do know how to assess BMPs, they're usually looking at a very small part of the county. So no one knows that there's this massive countywide problem going on, and because no one knew, there was no one advocating to restore inspection staffs or to provide the county with the other resources that it needs to have an effective BMP maintenance program. So let's do a few more questions before getting into how to do audits and why audits are so effective. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You were talking about the county, I'm just curious, so sometimes Annapolis is separate from the county and things, and sometimes it's not.
It is.
So in terms of BMPs, is it separate?
Yeah, I think Annapolis does their own.
And
Yeah.
you know how it's doing in terms of failure rate? Is it comparable to the county or worse or better?
Don't know offhand. So.
Richard, can you sum up the comment? We can't hear it here.
The question is, how is the city of Annapolis doing? Do they have their own inspection program? They do. And how are they doing? I don't know because I haven't looked. But I strongly suspect that tomorrow, at least some of you are going to be checking out stormwater BMPs within the city of Annapolis. So why are audits the most effective way to accelerate river restoration? Well, these are the 3 basic options for getting a clean water law enforced. You can report poor compliance site by site. And that does something, but it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. Again, I reported my first construction site violation when I was 22 in 1972. So, and for those folks who get frustrated by a lack of responsiveness to their complaints about a site, the next thing that they think of is to file suit against the contractor or the county. And those don't work very well either. They're not a very effective way to improve enforcement. What does work is to hold elected officials accountable for enforcing our clean water laws. So I said a minute ago, legal action usually isn't enough. The problems with legal action is it's expensive for the first of all, and because it's expensive, it actually tends to serve as a barrier to advocacy. Our clients win 90% of their cases. Rarely do they have to hire an attorney to win. Our victories usually come at a cost of less than $1,000. And this means making big changes in development projects. So the other problem with legal action is that frequently, once you start litigation, if you go to talk to the people actually make the decisions about how well these laws are going to be enforced, they say, can't talk about it, it's in court. And reporting problems on a site don't tend to result in a whole heck of a lot either. This is one of my embarrassments. This is Chelsea Court over in Silver Spring. The Friends of Sligo Creek paid me $6,000 to monitor this site on a weekly basis, and then try to work with the enforcement agency in Montgomery County to get problems solved. Montgomery is one of the most progressive and responsive counties in the state, but even there, we got pretty good perimeter control, sediment control. This is all super silt fence, but we could never get the inspector to enforce the erosion control requirements. And here's the reason why. Inspectors and even compliance chiefs, they don't set budgets and they don't set enforcement priorities. So the inspector is pretty much stuck with enforcing laws in whatever way they're told to enforce them. And if you try to push the inspector beyond that, and even push their chief beyond that, you get a lot of pushback. You don't seem to get anywhere, and it's very confusing and frustrating for citizens. So these are the folks who do set budgets and who do set enforcement priorities, either directly or indirectly. Of course, this is County Executive Steve Shue and the Anne Arundel County Council. So the key to improving compliance throughout a county and on one site is to hold these elected officials accountable for successes in improving compliance and accountable when compliance isn't going so well. Here you see an article that came out in the Baltimore Sun as a result of the 2015 Stormwater BMP survey. We had similar articles in the Sun and other papers. Could never get an article in the Capitol for some reason. Something going on with the Capitol, Tom. But at any rate, this publicity and a number of other things prompted Anne Arundel County to restore the inspection staff and to improve enforcement of erosion control laws. And you saw that in the 61% improvement in erosion control compliance achieved between 2014 and 2015. And we see it all the time in improving maintenance of stormwater BMPs. So these are the 4 keys for gaining the full benefits of the audit approach. You have to repeat audits annually. Elected officials have to know that every year there's going to be a report card on how well they're doing, just like the Chesapeake Bay report card comes out every year. The results have to be publicized widely. In all honesty, how many of you had ever heard of the Greater Baltimore Survey before this evening? God. So the results got to be widely publicized, and you need to hold elected officials accountable. You need to praise them when you're seeing improvements in the quality of control, and then you need to criticize when control isn't going so well. But the criticism has to be couched in constructive terms. You can't use a negative tone, one of recrimination of blame when dealing with this stuff. The first thing you need to do if you find that control quality isn't going so well is to sit down with the enforcement chiefs, and if you're lucky, they'll be candid with you about what they need. Gee, our inspection staff was cut from 6 to 1 10 years ago. This is what I was told by the Anne Arundel County enforcement chief then. What we then did was turn around and we started advocating to the council and the county executive to restore the inspection budget. So your language has to be couched in terms like this. We're appalled that the compliance level with erosion control and stormwater BMP maintenance was found to decline in the 2018 audit of the Severn watershed or entire Anne Arundel County. We're appalled that that's happened. We know that the county executive and the county council want clean water just as much as we do. We've identified these specific things that we think will improve the program, and we pledge the support of the Severn River Association and its thousands of members to the county executive and the county council as they seek to implement these measures. So that's what it takes. And what I'd like to show you now is a way that you can increase the level of support for Severn River restoration tenfold. No, in all honesty, tenfold. So there's about 100,000 people who live in the Severn River watershed. What?
149,000.
Great, even more. So we're going to increase support 15-fold. So only a fraction of those folks live on or near the Severn. And at least 90% live pretty far away from the river. They don't have any access to the river. They don't really care about the river. They care about other things because the river doesn't really touch their lives. So the good news is that for all the homes that are in the Severn River watershed, all 50,000 or so homes in the Severn watershed, there is a stream nearby like this one, the headwaters of Severn Run, or this unnamed tributary, or this stormwater pond called Lake Marion. And see all these homes? All these houses are a 5-minute walk away from one of these waterways. So this is what these waterways should look like. They should look clean and clear and safe, and they should look like something it would be okay to let your kid play in. And there should be such an abundance of life that this little darling here would spend hours down there just being completely fascinated by all the critters in the stream. That's what all 157 miles of tributaries to the Severn River should look like. Unfortunately, the vast majority of tributaries look like this. How many of you would let your kid play in that? So I don't see any hands. And this is the aquatic life that you usually find in these streams. They're pretty much dead. So how do you get people who live in remote places like Odenton and Severn to care about restoring the Severn? Well, it's easy. Instead of talking to them about, gee, you should do this because it'll make the Severn better, say, gee, if you do this, it'll make your neighborhood waters healthier and cleaner. It'll make them child safe and friendly, as opposed to the child safe, unsafe and unfriendly condition they're in right now. And oh, by the way, if you do this, it'll not only restore your neighborhood waters, it'll also restore that big waterway a few miles downstream called the Severn River. So by making this a truly watershed-wide effort, you can increase the level of public support for erosion control, for BMP maintenance, for forest conservation, for all the other things it takes to not only protect the remaining healthy portions of the Severn system, but to restore the much more numerous degraded portions to a condition where they're child safe and friendly. You may achieve a 15-fold increase in the amount of support that you get. And with that degree of public support, you will determine what happens next in terms of Severn River restoration. You will determine what clean water laws get enforced and don't enforce. You will force the county to come up with a way of generating the funds that are needed to maintain stormwater BMPs. And here's one of the many tools that we've come up with that makes it easier to reach out to watershed residents and inform them that there are neighborhood waters within 5 minutes of their home, but chances are those waters aren't in very good condition. And it gives simple things they can do. And this is an entry item. 1 out of every 20 watershed residents will be intrigued by this, and those will be your leaders throughout the watershed. They'll be the ones who organize community meetings to discuss how they can restore their neighborhood waters to a child-safe and friendly condition. So I'd like to leave you with this thought. It was true 150 years ago when Mr. Phillips said it about slavery. It's also true about clean water. So in terms of the publications that I showed, they can all be downloaded from our Watershed Audits webpage, and there's the web address up there. You can download this presentation, a narrated version of it, by clicking on this text here. And all of our fact sheets and other guidance documents are here. There's a bunch of YouTube presentations explaining how to do all this stuff here. And the Severn River Watershed Audit is there. And we also have these 4 other web pages that might be of interest. This one gives you more detail on exposed soil pollution. There's a petition there that folks can sign to encourage compliance. There's also a space there to report what you find on a construction site. This web page is our aquatic resource page. It explains how you can develop a watershed with literally no negative effects upon aquatic resources. In a lot of cases, you can actually make a river like the Severn better by developing in the right way. It's actually possible. These 2 web pages explain how we go about winning 90% of our cases by finding ways of modifying development projects to resolve the concerns that folks have, get more forest on the site, better stormwater BMPs, better erosion control compliance, without ever having to hire a lawyer. So when we do have to hire a lawyer, our smart legal strategies makes it a lot more likely that you'll bring the developer to the negotiating table in good faith. So I have a few more slides to show examples of what you could achieve, but what I'd like to do is stop here and see which way you want to go with the rest of the evening. Questions? Yes, ma'am?
Would you say the name of the website? I can't see.
It's Watershed Audits.
Watershed Audits, thank you.
Yeah, there's the web address up there.
Where?
Right there. Yes. Yes, sir. Ken.
When did Hurricane Agnes blow out the Whitemarsh? I remember it took Bel Air Road down.
1972.
72.
Was there another question over here? Yes, sir.
Do you know how many BMP inspectors there are today?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Do you know how many BMP inspectors there are in the county today? And if you were county executive and you had a great county council with 4 environmentalists on it, what would you do? Besides have inspectors.
Well, as of 2015, there were 6 full-time inspectors. Does anyone have a current number? What would I do? What I would do would be, I would say to the inspectors and their enforcement chief, start enforcing the erosion control law. In the Code of Maritime Regulations, there's a sentence that says that you have to use erosion control measures whenever active grading ceases on a construction site. That same language appears on every erosion sediment control plan, but for reasons that are frankly a bit unclear to me, that's never been enforced the way that perimeter controls are enforced. So it could be as easy as that. Yes, sir?
So, you've got a developer disturbing the land, big runoff, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, your advice here is to elect somebody else, and that's 4 years away. So what does a citizen do in the moment when you've got some misbehavior?
Well, this is one of the things that you can do. This is Odenton Gateway out in Odenton. And this is what it looked like in 2011. Actually, this is what it looked like on December 5th, 2011. John and Lynn and I and a few others, Dwayne, and I forget who else was part of that. I took them out and we all looked at this site. And then we wrote this letter to the developer, Elm Street Development, saying that, gee, we were really disappointed that we were seeing no erosion control on the construction site. And I got a call from the site manager from Elm Street about a week after we wrote this letter, and he said, gee, I'm not sure if we can do anything about that. And, you know, that would be a lot of straw, a lot of grass. And I said, well, that's a shame, because we're doing a tour in a week with several county council members and other elected officials, and we're going to bring them out to the site. So that's one of dozens of examples of tactics that you can use to get compliance where it seems like you're not getting anywhere. But again, the audit approach, The 2014 and 2015 audit, there was no election. I don't think that there was much in the way of an election cycle there. I think we put out the results after the 2014 primary occurred. So we achieved a 61% improvement in compliance in about 6 to 12 months when there was no election involved. Sir? Brad?
Richard, don't you find a very high rate of compliance with the friendly letter approach?
I know you've been experimenting a lot with it. I have good success with it. How about, this is Brad Canal from the Magothy River Association, and they've been doing a lot of this stuff in their watershed. What's your experience been, Brad?
I would say approaching 80% of contractors
Wow.
respond in a positive way when approached in a positive way. With a friendly letter, we know you're concerned, we're concerned. How about we do this? Can we count on you to do such and such? It's been far more than half positive. In fact, I would say less than, not much more than 1 in 10 require contact with the county.
That's fantastic, Brad. I wasn't aware that it was that successful. That's incredible. Ma'am?
So that's an amazing success rate, 8%. I'm wondering what the average size of the projects that you're talking about are. I'm thinking with a 50-acre project with a $6.5 million budget, just to level the property, not even build anything.
Most of them are home sites, what I'm referring to.
Okay, so there's a little bit more PR, and they're going to be selling the homes.
Deep Creek Villas, not so lucky.
Okay, thank you.
I think Odenton Gateway was 30 acres.
Okay.
Is there another hand that? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I'm curious, Richard. The people from the Annapolis Neck are, upset because they've tried several things and nothing seems to be working for them. How would your program help them?
Well, my suggestion would be, why don't we find a time when I can get together with the Annapolis Neck people? Let's go out and take a look. And we could have a conversation with the inspection staff to find out what's going on there. But have you contacted your county council representative about what's going on? Okay. Have you gotten much publicity in the Capitol about it?
There's been one letter to the editor. I think there have been letters to the editor that have not been published. I'm not familiar with all the media outlets that we've reached out to, but there have been a number of them. And I think some of it has to do with where the donor dollars come from.
Right.
I mean, in terms of the council.
Right. Well, I guarantee you that there are tactics available to us that would increase the likelihood that you would see improvements on that site. But I suspect that the first thing we need to do is to get past that impasse with the inspectors where they say if there's exposed soil on the site, they don't have the authority to do anything about that. Anne Arundel County is actually unique in Maryland. Anne Arundel is the only county that actually has a regulation that says that when you start building houses or other structures on a site, once you get up to the first floor level, once you've completed the foundation, you have to stop all work on the site and stabilize everything. No other county has that. So that's a really good law. And with this site that you're talking about, it sure sounds like it reached that point. So, right. Well, it's kind of the same thing. The idea is when you finish grading the site, what they do is before you can start really developing the site, you got to stabilize everything. So that's the idea. Yeah, ma'am.
Now, you said that when you finish leveling the site, that's when you can start putting on the hay and then stabilizing. But what about before the site has been finished, when you've got mountains of soil?
The mountains are supposed to be stabilized too.
They're not.
Well, that's a violation of the law.
But the county doesn't see it that way.
That's why we need to use the political process to force them to interpret it that way. Again, it worked in 2015 and 2014. There's no reason why it can't work today. Yes, ma'am.
What are the qualifications for the inspectors?
Don't know offhand. Does anyone know? Ooh.
What's the question?
What are the qualifications for the inspectors? Because if the inspectors are not qualified and trained.
In all honesty, it's rare that that's the situation. Being an inspector is not a pleasant job. I mean, just about everybody that you deal with.
One comment, Deep Creek Villas, that you mentioned, is one of the worst sites I've ever seen, ever. And the inspector there was Eva Kirshner, who is not an engineer, who works on the staff of INP. It depends on the qualifications of the inspector.
Right. Yes, Anastasia?
There is a certification that you can get from the Maryland Department of the Environment, and they actually have an online program to educate you past the certification. I don't know if the inspectors have that certification. That would be a good question. But to my question, Richard, what is your assessment of the strength of the laws in Anne Arundel County? And are we inheriting our regulations from the state? Are we conforming to, just by law, with MDE's stormwater and erosion control laws?
Yeah, the original Sediment Control Act was passed in 1970, and that required that every county adopt their own law. The stabilization requirement, the erosion, we got that passed in 1979. There was a coalition of us who lobbied for that. It's now a federal requirement. Erosion control, it's now required of every construction site in the country over 1 acre. So it's been around for a long while. It just hasn't been enforced very aggressively, but as you saw, between 2014 and 2015, we got a 61% improvement in compliance. So, yes, ma'am.
Are there stringent fines for runoff or from a lack of sediment control? And if and how do we enforce those fines?
The county fine is not much of a disincentive. The state fine is a lot more effective. The state fine is, I think, $10,000 a day. And a former enforcement chief for Anne Arundel County told me that whenever they're trying to get a recalcitrant contractor to toe the line, they sick the Maryland Department of the Environment on them with their tougher fines. So there's room for improvement there.
And where is that $10,000 a day defined? You're saying like per day of what?
It's in, for each day the violation continues. So it's in state law, the Code of Maryland Regulations.
Richard, I'd just like to address the lady's comment that the thinking about the county or the state to actually impose a $10,000 fine is dreamland. They are not going to do it. They have no incentive to do it. The only incentive is for people like us to get angry and do like Richard says, start making working the way up to the political system. And next month, we have a Politico coming to talk to us. So maybe you ought to come and talk to Chris Trumbauer, who will be here to explain the political process. But I don't get lost in the weeds about these fines. The county, it's a joke, and everybody knows it. They have no desire to enforce the law.
You've got the perfect opportunity now. The primary is June 26th. So if I were in your position, if I were deeply concerned about this, we've got a mailing list of 200 community groups throughout Anne Arundel County, and you all probably have an even bigger list. If I were you, I would put together an agenda for improving erosion sediment control enforcement, stormwater BMP maintenance, any other clean water law that's important to you. Come up with a list of maybe 5 or 10 things. Ask each one of the candidates for county executive and county council to pledge to support all of those things if they're elected. And then using a non-501c3 organization like the Sierra Club, get a announcement out to as many voters as you can between now and June 26th, telling them which candidates pledge to support the Anne Arundel County Clean Water Agenda and which ones refuse to. So if you want to have a quick, big impact on improving compliance with these laws, that's the way to do it. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to, the Anne Arundel County Watershed Stewards Academy,
resources available, like Richard was talking about. It has a listing of environmentally friendly.
I wish that were true.
They also, a lot of people are within communities. It's a community-based volunteer organization. If you reach out to them, they'd be able to help you on small-scale projects, not talking to major developers.
Yes, ma'am.
My name's Cindy Hall, and I'm in the current class for WSA of becoming a Master Watershed Steward. This is the largest class, it's the 10th class. We go through, there's about 40 of us. Each one of us has to perform a capstone project, so that's 40 GMPs going in. But I highly recommend it. It's very educational. Anybody who's interested in that. And you come out of there with a lot of resources, not including education, but contacts.
Have you seen any of the stuff that I talked about this evening in the Watershed Stewards class?
Yeah.
That's surprising. They actually had me do presentations there in 2011, 2012. Then something happened. I think I know what happened. And they wouldn't have anything to do with me after that. So they wouldn't return the phone call.
I'll mention your name at our next class.
Oh, okay.
I can tell you that the class has just been awesome. I have learned so much, and it's migrating to the surrounding counties because in the class there was a very large population from Annapolis City, which was unusual, but we have people from Harrod County, Baltimore City actually taking the class. It's over at Arlington Echo.
The stewards do a lot of good work. I don't mean to belittle them, but what I would like to say is that if you're looking for guidance on how to do the stuff I've talked about this evening, go to the resources we got, because we've distilled it down to its simplest and most effective terms. So you don't need to go through a long course to get to that point. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say, I agree with you. I'm Diana Muller. I'm Executive Director at Chesapeake Bay Savers and former South River Keeper. We wouldn't be having a lot of the stuff in this area right here, Annapolis Town Center, if it wasn't for the lawsuit the Federation did. So sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand. I litigated, and if we didn't, we wouldn't have stormwater vaults over there at all. We were seeing straight runoff like we see all the time. The infrastructure actually needs to be designed for the 3 to 4 inch rain event, not the 1 inch rain events. We need to go back all the way to MDE when the permits start again. We need to start taking into account climate extremes and really holding everybody accountable, because whoever we vote in, just like the whole NRA gun thing, it's money talks and you know what walks. So we need to make sure you just don't talk. You sometimes have to put a line in the sand and use litigation at the end. And it works. Otherwise, right, otherwise Annapolis Town Center would still be sending straight mud into Church Creek.
Lawsuits can accomplish a lot. So, any other questions? John, back to you. Or Tom, back to you.